In the last video, we spoke about the compile script that we're about to put together. Let's now change over to our code editor and start writing it out. I'm inside of my compile.js file. At the very top, we're going to import a couple of different modules. These are going to look very familiar because we already required a lot of them into the previous compile script that we had put together. So I'll say const path is require path. I'll pull in the Solidity compiler. And then finally, I'm also going to pull in the fs module. But this time around, we're going to make one small change. So I'm going to say fs is require fs-extra, like so. So in the past, we were working with the fs module. Remember, this is a part of the Node standard library. It is short for file system, and it gives us access to the file system on our local computer. We're not using fs this time though. Instead, we are using a community-made module called fs-extra. fs-extra is very similar to the fs module, but it has, as you might guess, a couple of extra functions tied to it. So in other words, this is kind of an improved version of the fs module that has a couple extra functions that are going to save us a lot of time as we start writing some code inside this file. So basically, it's the file system module, just a couple of helpers. All right, so now inside of here, the first thing we're going to do is start putting together some logic to delete the entire build folder if it already exists. So at the very top, we're going to first get our path to that build folder. Now the build folder doesn't exist yet, but we can eventually imagine that we will have a folder inside of our ethereum directory called build, like so. So I want to get a reference to this folder right here. To do so, we'll use the path module along with the resolve method on it. So I'll say const build path is path.resolve, and then we're going to take our current working directory by using __ name. Remember, there's two underscores right here. So that gets us into our ethereum directory. And then to actually run the build script, we'll pass in a second argument that is a string of build. Then with this reference to the build directory, we can call a function on the fs module to remove that entire directory and everything inside of it. So we'll write out fs.remove sync build path. Remove sync right here is one of the improved or kind of extra functions that is included with this fs-extra module. The default or standard file system module that is included with Node doesn't have the ability to easily remove one file or one folder and everything inside of it in a single command. If you want to use the default fs module, this gets a lot more complicated than what you see right here. So remove sync just looks at this file, or excuse me, this folder, and deletes it and everything inside of it. Okay, so now after that, we can start doing the next step on here. So we need to read in the campaign.sol file from the contracts folder, very similar to what we were doing before. So first, we'll get a path to the contracts directory. And excuse me, not the contracts directory, but the actual campaign contract file. So I'll say campaign path is path.resolve, and then we want __ dir name, contracts, and then the actual file name, which is campaign.sol, like so. Next, we're going to read in the source code from that file. And again, this is going to be very similar to what we did previously on our lottery project. So I'll say const source is fs.read file sync. We'll pass in the campaign path and then specify the encoding of that file, which is UTF-8. So we've now got the contents of the campaign file. Next, we're going to use the Solidity compiler to compile everything that we just pulled out of that file. So we'll say const output is Solidity compiler.compile, and then we're going to say source 1, and the only property that we care about that is coming off of this compile process right here is the contracts property. We don't care about any other output from the compiler. The only thing we care about is the contracts that we just compiled. So we're going to pull off the contracts property and assign that to output, like so. Now the output variable right here contains two separate objects. One object is the output from compiling our campaign contract, and the other is the output from compiling the campaign factory. So we're going to eventually loop over this campaign thing right here and then write out the contents of it to two separate files. Before we do that, however, we do need to make sure that we create the build directory. So remember, up here at step 1, we deleted the entire build folder, including the actual folder itself. So before we start trying to write any output to the build directory, we have to recreate that folder. To create that folder, we can write fs.ensure dir sync. And then we can pass in the build path that we had created earlier. Ensure dir right here, or ensure directory, checks to see if a directory exists. And if it does not exist, this function will create it for us. So essentially this line of code is going to create that build folder. Now the last thing that we're going to do is loop over this output object. We're going to take each contract that exists inside there and write it to a different file inside of our build directory. This part is going to be a little bit more complicated, but we'll write out the code for it, and then as soon as we run this code, it'll be really obvious exactly what's going on. So let's write out the code, and then we'll talk about what it's doing. I'm going to say for let contract in output. Then I'm going to call a function off the fs module. I'm going to say fs.output JSON sync. I'm going to call that function, and we're going to pass in two separate arguments. These two separate arguments are going to be a little bit long, so I'm going to give myself a little bit of space to type. I'm going to say path.resolve, and I'm going to build the path to the file that I want to save this to. So I'm going to pass in build path, and then the actual file name, which is going to be contract. So this is the name of the contract that we just pulled out of this output object, and then I want to make sure it has a .json file extension. So I'm going to say contract plus .json. And then as a second argument to the output JSON sync function, I'm going to write output square braces contract, like so. Okay, so I know this is a nasty little piece of code right here. I know this looks pretty nasty. Let's first run our compile script. We're going to verify that it works the way we expect, and then we'll talk about exactly what this for loop is doing for us. And we'll also print out a couple of different steps inside of here using some console logs so we can get a better idea of what's going on. So to run that script, I'm going to go over to my terminal. I'll change into the Ethereum directory, and then I'm going to run node compile.js. Now with any luck, we're going to wait a second or two, and then we should get kicked right back to the command line. Okay, so I got kicked right back to the command line. But if I go back over to my code editor, I can see that I have my build directory, and inside there, I've got two JSON files. One is campaign.json, and the other is campaignfactory.json. Notice that there is a little colon in front of each file name. We'll fix up that colon in just a second. But first, let's take a break. We'll come back in the next video, and we're going to break down this for loop that we just wrote right here. So I'll see you in just a minute.